we last spoke, but it feels to me at least like it's been ages, because so many conversations have happened since we challenged each other to go off and ask. That was our last one, is asking what in the construct of gender to our children and parents, vertical relations, what is to be kept, what should we keep and what should we change, basically. And on my side, it got really messy, really complicated, really interesting, really headfucky. And I just was curious, like, how, like, as a checking question, like, has anything shifted in your mind since our last session after talking to people?
I would actually start by saying, like, part of why I'm doing these conversations with you is also for my own development. I think I'm like pretty aware of all of these gender things, so it's always nice to have conversation with someone else who's also pretty aware, and to get challenged in a way, or to pop in questions, or actually also to see my own reaction. And I think, like, part of that, the reactions I have felt within me after our last talk was actually triggered by something you said about, like, what's the real purpose of this. I don't even remember if this were live or after, but we talked about, like, what's the meaning of this? Is it to have your pain acknowledged? And I actually realized, also having these conversations with my parents and kids, is like, I do feel a lot of pain that I feel needs to be acknowledged. And it is also personal, but also on behalf of, like, all humankind. And
Mm,
it was really interesting for me to see. And it also made me have a deeper, or even deeper, understanding on why this topic is so difficult. Because I'm
mm,
pretty sure, without being a male, that you have the same wounds, just different places. And these wounds are really not recognized, and they are so sore and infected. And I'm not perfect at all, but if this is part of what I do professionally and I'm still feeling it, then I think
mm.
this is really an issue that's also interesting.
Wow. Thank you for saying that. I think it's radically honest of you to say so. I also have some pain to be acknowledged, and I think the whole level of whys on this conversation. One, on the personal, on the micro level, me, you, our own individual internal constellation and thinking, and in there is a certain amount of personal growth, personal letting go, personal processing, metabolizing, and therefore being acknowledged.
Yeah.
But there's also a meso team level, as in within our own communities who we encounter conversations with regularly. And there's also a macro level, I think, also beyond that, on the wider circle, perhaps even a mundo level of reflection, where it's like around the world, and where the question that we time mundo level question, which is why it's so difficult to answer, because it takes us into the global perspective of what could be changed. By the way, while I'm talking, would you just be able to check the settings and up the resolution? I think we might be able to get full high def on your picture, if it's not already the case, like we did last time. I'm wondering if that's or maybe it's now looking more clear, if it's already. But yeah, the why for me is also, like you, personal inquiry, a personal, like, first of all, look in the mirror, what can I change? So is there anything that you're going to change since we've last spoken? Because I can say for sure there was one thing I'm going to change, but what do you want to start?
Yeah, but I can say it's kind of like the same thing, that I will be absolutely more aware. And actually, I think that I can meet men, or the masculine, with more empathy, because it was a realization that it's to be honest, it's kind of hard not to get triggered. For example,
Mm,
we had the talk with the rape, and I felt that that was kind of like getting me a little bit there, like, hey. So
mm,
not to go into the pain, because, like, I don't think that we are going down the mountain we talked about last time, about us as sexes being on each mountaintop, and
mm, mm, mm,
insisting on having these acknowledgement of pain isn't the way to get down there. We need to really heal ourselves. So for me, like, what I'm going to change is absolutely to bring more awareness into this, and be even more self-reflecting on, like, what part of me is actually reacting right now when I am in some kind of gender, not conflict, but discussion or awareness, or see how it's played out.
I think for me, it's going to be about the thanking for the thing that I judge. I judge very quickly when somebody is not willing to have a conversation. I'm a communicator. I've spent my entire life studying communication behaviors. For me, it's so obvious that these issues are non-issues when they start to be talked about. That when we actually, and this is something that comes from, for example, in the teaching profession, when you look at teaching, like we know that a lot of misunderstandings are down to the teacher's bad framing of a topic, or in a conflict, generally it comes down to people not having spoken about the real assumption and needs. So to me, like, it's always very obvious that let's just talk about it with the kind intention of understanding and empathizing and respecting each other's differences and being complementary. And where I get triggered is when somebody just goes, actually, I don't want to talk about it. Because either I cannot, I don't feel comfortable, I'm unwilling, I'm feeling too much emotional turmoil and anger about it. And I respect that. And therefore, if I apply my own rules of communication, which is say thank you to a boundary, not sorry, so that the people feel safe to say no, then my only possible reaction to somebody who says, I don't want to talk about it, is thank you. And that creates inside me a general moment of miniature anger. I feel like, how isn't that just the definition of privilege, of not talking about it? And isn't it often the men who don't want to talk about it? Because in the people I've talked to, generally, it has been, all of the people I've talked to have been women. The men have actually either not said anything or said, I don't feel comfortable. And so what I'm going to change, note to self, and those of you listening, if there's any of my dudes out there listening to this who haven't answered, I'm saying, I thank you for not answering and I thank you for the boundary, but it does trigger me. It does trigger me because I feel like that is actually part of the problem, is not talking about it, even if it is uncomfortable. I think that's the mark of privilege, is being able to say, no, I don't want to talk about it. And so in that sense, I agree that there is a mountaintop and we can't really do much from the top of the mountain of our high. There was this Instagrammer this morning that I saw, I think he's this Finnish, Shiko Muya official. He was saying there was this idea, he's a black dude in Finland, so he's very often talking about racism. And he said, like, there seems to be Olympic of, what did he call it? The Olympic of entitlement of suffering or something. That it's like, if you've suffered a lot, you have more right to speak about something. Like if I'm trans, if I'm a lesbian, disabled, trans, Asian person in Finland, let's say, to be caricatural, I somehow have more credit to talk about it. Whereas me as a white male, cisgender, I have literal zero credit on that. And that problem is, to me, the triggering thing at the moment is the non-communication, not just on a political level, but on in a family, personal, friend level. So that was my trigger. And what I'm going to change from the first conversations already is that I'm going to stick to the thank you for setting a boundary and learn to forgive myself for getting angry about that non-communication.
It's kind of also, for me, I love that you share this, and thank you so much for doing that, because for me it makes so much sense. And because like what I kind of realized, and I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, is like from the conversations that I've had, I have talked with 3 women / girls and 2 men, is that the men were so uncomfortable about this topic and so scared to like say the wrong things, and the females were not. So that's also within what you said, but also it's like, it's not the things that we talked about, that we are talking about as a society about gender, that's the issue. It is absolutely the things we don't talk about. It's the things that we are not aware of, the things that are like luring in like the back of our mind, or like not being spoken. That's for me the real issues. It's not that I think that equal pay isn't a great topic, but it's like, it's just a branch. Like, let's go to the roots, and we are not seeing or talking about the roots. So I feel that's pretty aligned with what you said, that we actually are not having the conversation that's the most important.
So here's now where we could probably just jump into, last time when we did the debrief, you said like, oh, I don't mind getting more into the potential conflict and everything. So just as a word of framing for us to navigate this tricky conversation is that, yes, just like many men, I identify as a man and I get really uncomfortable about these topics because I've not had many of them in a way that hasn't been violent, that hasn't been blame oriented and pain oriented. So like my invitation for us on this is to if we do go into any kind of conflict, that we keep them as functional conflict, meaning that we use the conflict as a creative tension, as an opportunity to ask a how might we question that's present future oriented, and that helps us to untangle how we might create harmonious, respectful relations between whatever we identify as tensions, gender or other, because I think it's not only about gender, this topic, it's about interdependence of many things, personalities. So my invitation to you and I, not just to you, but to us as a collectively intelligent entity, hopefully, is that if we do get into these trigger moments like we've just done so far, is that we voice the trigger, we own it, and we say, actually, what's interesting in this that we can, use as clay to mold a future something or other.
Yeah, and you know that I am absolutely on the same page with that. I think it's so important. We both also are very interested in communication, and for me, I always see these issues as opportunity to grow. And I'm not seeking to either trick or be tricked, but when it happens, I'm really cool with that because I do see it as a stepping stone for learning. And
Mm.
also, I'm a huge fan of reflecting, not reacting. And so bringing awareness and being honest. And I like to share my truth, and I hope you will too. And also be able to handle the other person's truth. And for me, talking with the men in this topic, in our homework, I really, really had to be objective and stay on my own lane. I'm telling you, like, I was
Yeah,
like, oh, so what I'm hearing is that correct? Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that.
Good exercise in empathy. Okay, well, let's just jump in because our homework to each other was like go off and talk to the vertical relations, parents, children. Um, I I had a number of conversations. You did too. Maybe what we can do is that we can debrief this by. I struggled to try and summarize everything because there was so much content. So
Yes.
maybe what we could do is that we could start from who you spoke to, who I spoke to, and then use a couple of points, and then see if they resonate from what you've heard. Maybe who did you speak to?
I spoke to my mom and dad had a divorce when I was 2. So
Hmm.
I decided not to have like my mom and stepdad. I think they would probably on the same kind of level. So I actually asked my dad and my mom. I also asked my 2 daughters. One is 25, the other one is 13, or 13 next week. And then
Hmm.
actually I had also I cheated a little bit because that's only one male and I wanted another male opinion. So I asked a younger male colleague who's also in his 20s because I thought it was interesting to have like a young male point of view as well.
Nice. Okay. So I also talked to quite a few. I don't want to put their names, and because some of the things it's difficult for them to share. So I have one. Well, I have one daughter and one son, biological children, who are in different countries, Asia and America at the moment, studying. And they are
Interesting.
having a very different cultural perspective because they're immersed in extremely different cultures. And then I have my adoptive daughters, one who's non-binary, and the other who is identifying as a woman, and they're all the same ages. They're all in their 20s ish, so that generation, and very different conversations. I also talk to their partners. So, for example, one of my adoptive daughter's boyfriend is Estonian. And then I talked to my father, who over dinner I gave him the brief, the question to chew upon while they were eating, and I said, I'll expect your because they're him and his new wife, or like because he was divorced and my mother passed away, so it's his new wife, and they're both teachers, retired headmasters. So I framed it as homework for them to go and think about this from the point of view of education of the future generations. They loved it. And I had an extremely long conversation with my mother-in-law, and my father didn't want to comment. So
Hmm.
And even though I have beautiful relation with my father, we have amazing conversations, he just felt that he couldn't answer. And I thought that was interesting, even though I know the topics have been approached with him. We've had these conversations, but in this case, that question probably didn't open up enough clarity for him to answer. And instead, I got my mother-in-law, who gave me lots of examples from when she was a head teacher, headmistress in France, giving tackling this issue. And her own child is a gender fluid, somebody who's been through part of the transition of gender. So
Mm.
she has been, the mother has been in a great like investigation of that ever since the 1980s, actually, before
Wow.
the day when this was actually fashionable. So those topics kind of, and my son didn't feel like he could answer. He said, "I can't answer. It's too complicated. I can't give you an honest answer because it's too complicated. What I can do is raise other questions that this raises in my mind. Have you considered this, that, and the other?" I was like, okay, take the pen. So
It's actually
where
really
do you?
fun you said that because I called my dad, sorry for
Yeah,
interrupting,
yeah.
and then he was like, "Can you send me the messages or the questions? Can you send it to me and I'll get back to you in a couple of
And think
days?" I'm like,
about
"No."
it.
Yeah, I was like, "No, I just want like what's on top of your tongue or head or like what you call
Mm-mm,
it." And
yeah.
so,
So
and I
so
think
first
for us,
insight is that go on. Yeah.
no, I was just saying like, so for us, this is like a fun topic. It's interesting, but everyone I spoke to were like, when I asked the question, like you could actually like see the fear in their eyes, like, what? So this is like this is deep questions and questions
Mm,
that are so inflected with so many feelings and also perhaps a bit of fear.
mm. I think that's a really good insight to just put, like, it's an obvious one, but it's not only a difficult, complicated question, but I think it has a lot of fear attached to it.
Yeah,
Fear of being judged, fear of being wrong. And like from a communication perspective, it's very obvious that it's one of the most close to the ego. By ego, I mean like identity, so
yeah,
that
yeah,
we identify to something and take it so seriously that we're afraid of talking about it because it feels too intimate, too close to our own egos. And just like personality can be a tricky topic, or disability or non-neurotypicalness, being on the spectrum, can be difficult for the
mhm,
same reasons. Is that I identify to be in ADHD, or I identify to be in a woman, and those then make it difficult to step back and look at ourselves objectively and go, what does it really
yeah,
mean in terms of our
yeah.
behavior? Where do you want to go? What was your first from what who you spoke to? What was the first
Yeah,
thing that popped up?
I spoke with one of my daughters first, and I think like for me, I was thinking like if I should give some context. I actually think I won't.
Mm-hmm.
My oldest daughter, she said that living in a male-dominated world, she didn't see anything worth saving or holding on to at all. And then when I asked her like, what would you like to change? And I don't know for the people who've seen the Barbie movie, which I have and I love it. There is like this dialogue or monologue by America Ferrera where she speaks about all the double standard there is for females. Like there is an expectation for us to take care of our family and stay at home, but also we need to be boss babes, bitches who have a great education. We need to be in charge, but we can't be too direct and masculine. We need to be soft, but we can't be too emotional. We need to be pretty, but if we are too pretty, we can't be intelligent. And like there is all of these things that society have, as he
Mm-hmm.
explained, and I agree, is that it's so difficult being, that's one of the things that are really difficult about being a woman, that you really can't do it right in the eyes of the society. There will always be someone who's like freaking out or like saying that's not feminine, that's not right, or you are too something. And it really doesn't matter. Like if you are like I'm growing up being a virgin, then you're a prude. If you are sexual free, then you're a slut. It's like we
Mm-hmm.
really can't make it right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was her perspective.
So there was not much. That was interesting because I had a very similar echo. Is that very little was what do we keep.
Yeah.
But that was, I think, partly down to how people are defining gender. Because, so by the way, I don't know if you've seen the documentary I posted last time, Beyond Men and Masculinities, but I think in that documentary, you get exactly the picture of what you've just drawn about women
Mm.
for men, which is
Oh,
that men are, no matter what you do, you're either too dominant or too meek.
yeah.
If you're kind, you're seen as being feminine and meek and being a standard that society puts on your table. And if you're too dominant, you're seen as a toxic male, and
Mm.
therefore you are in a little box on a tightrope, being able to do very little because you can't show your emotions, you can't talk about your emotions, you can't talk about these topics, you should just act on them. And if you don't
Mm.
know how to act on them, you're then basically not doing anything and you're staying in your comfort zone. And also, of course, then the huge toxicity of parental models being put onto you, where the parents passing down to the next generation their own insecurities, pains, and traumas. So that documentary, by the way, is really interesting to watch for every gender, because it talks about the invisible aspect of patriarchy, which is not talked about in media as much. So I could echo that. But again, if we come down from what is the positive, I didn't get anything.
My mom had a really good one.
What did she get?
She said like she loved like the gentleman thing, like holding the door, paying the bill. Like my stepdad, he always like opens the door in the car for my mom. So like all of like the old-fashioned gentleman traits. She said
Yeah.
like she would be so sad if they were gone.
But it's interesting you mention that, because my daughter, who was then, she was interviewing her friends. She was also having these conversations in parallel without knowing that we were talking about this. And she said to me, I had to say, the one thing I would like to change is the hypocrisy of some girls. She was talking to some of her friends who were very international, grew up in very reactive, old fashioned societies that were very gendered, who then grew up in Sweden and studies in Jakarta, so very international bubble. And she said, like, she's like a feminist. She's fighting for gender equality, but she's bitching about her boyfriend not paying the bill.
Yeah.
And she said to me, like, what I would change with this gender topic is the congruence, the alignment. Well, she's my daughter, so she talks about communication psychology, but basically the alignment of what people say versus what they do, and their intention behind it, their intention on the feeling think level. And often what happens is that people say one thing, maybe or
Yeah.
motorways of thought, and then in their behaviors they're acting in disconnect. And so
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
she would change that. But she said, like, if I really want equality, then why am I asking and expecting the one gender to provide?
I think like I so agree, but I think there is a very important point here is
Mm,
like equalness. I don't think we are seeking equalness. We are seeking that we are equally worthy. So like it's
mm,
like the same thing. Like I hear a lot of men who says like, so you're female or like women are ready to go into military. And I'm saying like if a female wants, yes, but I think that's actually something that's more in the male nature.
mm,
um,
mm,
so it's not that we need to do the same thing. I don't think we need to be measured by the same standards, but it's that we are worth the same. And my daughter also talked about this, where she says like the qualities that you think of as feminine, like being caretakers and empathy and being connective, like in family, like these are seen as less worth than the male qualities. So I think being equal means that a nurse will be paid the same as a attorney. And of course, a male and a female can be both, but like if we are just being like asking general population, most people would say that there are nurses that are females and a lawyer
mm.
or an accountant or whatever would be a male. And so how the payment or like the salary is actually like distribute also show what's the the different work areas that we credit as being most important. And often it is male dominated workplaces. So
So
she also,
perspective.
Sorry.
a perspective that just builds on that, and we can just keep interrupting each other. I think it's fine because we're in
Yeah.
a dialogue here. But my son, who's in Egypt, he's taking a lot of lessons on culture, and he wants to be into diplomacy, so he's very aware of conflicts and intercultural issues. And he said to me, like, here the topic of equity is way more visible, and gender equity is about the basic needs that are different. So it's starting from an acknowledgement that there are differences, but using those differences as a legal justification for fairness rather than fairness on the basis of equality. So he said,
Yeah.
he gave me two examples. He says, like, if you compare Syria to Egypt on divorce rights, in Egypt, different type of society, but in Egypt you have a different way of compensating if you divorce the woman. And I might get this wrong, listening to this, Emperor Tariq or any other Egyptians, please correct me, but he said that you as a woman would then get the house de facto until all the children are married off and the man doesn't have a say. And that's an example of equity based on the
Yeah.
fact that the woman doesn't have as much access on the workplace,
Yeah.
and so on. And in Syria, a similar scenario where the actual compensation is assuming that the woman would want to stay at home and child rear as opposed to go off into the workforce, is therefore built into the legislation where they compensate that by giving the woman more. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that highlights that in the conversation, we cannot only talk about equality, we have to be able to talk about equity,
Yeah.
which accounts for what is reality today, not what is the wishful thinking of tomorrow, where everybody has equal access to all the jobs and gender is not an issue. It might be one day, but right now it is clearly not the case
Yeah.
in many parts of the world. So equity, I think, was like one of my takeaways from talking to them as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
One
I
more.
absolutely.
Go, go, go,
Go.
go, go.
No, I just wanted to say that I agreed, and then I wanted actually to add something new. So if you had something more on that specific
Let's
thread.
jump. Let's go in. Let's go in because I think I had also some. I think the longest conversations I had was with my non-binary daughter and my mother-in-law who's been teaching and child raising a gender fluid person. So, but maybe you go into where you
Yeah,
were
because
naturally drawn
actually
to.
what I wanted to share was that the male actually had a lot of things that they liked about living in a male-dominated world.
Mm.
And my dad, he said it. In a way, I think it's quite funny, and then absolutely not. But what he said, like, was that two captains on the same ship will never get the ship in the harbor. So he thinks that society needs to be led by either male or female. And he thought that we had different strengths, and the male strengths would be like logic and reason, and the females would be like family and feelings, and that a world would be run more smoothly if it was ran by men.
That just reminds me of what I was reading last night. I'm currently rereading this book called The Mythology of Sex. So
Yeah.
it's a historical account of the gender and sexuality topic down to 20,000 BC, meaning from prehistory to history. And the author is a woman. She's a therapist, and she's specialized on gender studies. And one of the things that came out of that is that she starts her book as a disclaimer. She says, "It's a really tricky topic to talk about. I'm writing a book
Yeah.
about it, and therefore I'm going to use, when I say masculine and feminine, I'm going to go back to the metaphorical view of the biological construct, which is the womb-like qualities for being the feminine, containing, relating." And the penis-like qualities of external focus and slightly somehow confronting the world with a single mind. Like, and she says, I know that some people will criticize that view of gender, but because, of course, you can change gender and your biological gender can still be the same while you do a gender change and so on. There's so many different levels at which we can get confused. the
Yeah.
the, the takeaway from that was that sexuality and gender need to be carefully set apart, because we often then bunch, and when I mean sexuality, if we extrapolate, the polarity of dynamics between lead and follow of people, which are in the workplace, which are in politics, which are about decision making, are also confused with those qualities. So then we say a masculine leader, feminine leader. What does it actually mean?
I think we can both agree that Margaret Thatcher was a masculine leader.
If we define masculine as the traits to do with what we just automatically assumed earlier, was that masculine is more rational, feminine is more emotional, and I think that to me is a fundamental problem, actually, because then how does a man tap into their feelings in a leadership role, and how does a woman tap into rational, pragmatic ness in as a leader?
I don't
If we
see that as a
gender
problem at
those.
all. Because like I think to be really balanced is to embrace everyone, I believe, have masculinity and femininity inside of them. So how we kind of like it's like a scale, and everyone is different, and you need to. And I think that doesn't matter what sex you have on the outside. I believe for me that I was born as a female because I need to have more weight on the female. I so respect that not all people feel that. That's what my truth is. So I feel no matter what you are or are not or identify as, it's about finding your own balance within the masculine and feminine.
So that the idea of balance came out as well with um, my mother-in-law. So she talked about being a teacher and a headmistress. So she said in France you have this tradition of when somebody does something wrong, you do a conseil de discipline, which is like a disciplinary council of teachers, sometimes parents and student representatives, and then you basically tribunal the person, kick them out of the school or punish them in some way. And she said in her whole career she did a handful only. Many head teachers are doing them all the time. She did 3 in her whole career, and she said she didn't need them because her view on it is that it's about understanding the balance of complementarity. That as her daughter was born a boy, transitioned as a teenager without hormonal treatment, and identifies to a they, but in France you don't have pronoun they, so it's her, and they are actually sort of gender fluid, and they have been very harmoniously welcomed in their work, in their circles of friends. The only problem they had was with their sister. And then the whole thing for her was not about gender or even sexuality. She said, first of all, sexuality is separate. My daughter, born boy, sexuality has not changed, even though they transitioned. But what is really important to me is that we see those differences not as right or wrong, better or worse, but as complementary. And as a teacher, that is my angle, is that I was teaching them to understand that whatever, if that child is stealing, they have an imbalance. Their parent might have this. There's a reason for it. Explaining to them why they're being expelled for a day is way more important than punishing them. And she gave me this story, which I thought was like slightly connected to this. She said, I had a case where a student was caught stealing in the purse of a teacher. And all the teachers went up in arms, expel the little bastard, and she said, well, let's look at this objectively. There's you as a teacher be falsifying documents. So I'm only willing to expel that student if I kick you out of the education system. Take it or leave it. And they kept the child, and they did a different type of punishment, which was more remedial, and that was her approach to education, is that let's open the conversation. First of all, when anger is around, you sit the child on the chair and you let them sit in quiet until the anger dies down. There's no point in talking to somebody in a state of anger. And it reminded me of the angry debates between angry misogyns and angry feminists, where like nothing much comes out. She says, like the same with students. You put them in the room, I sit them down, I close the door, I open my computer, I wait half an hour, do my work, and when they've literally calmed down, I then talk to them about what has happened. So
Nice.
a couple of thoughts there. I don't know how that builds into what you found with your other conversations.
I actually don't feel it really builds that much into my conversations, but I do love everything you shared about it. And I think it's like for me a whole other topic that's also super interesting to how we actually embrace these things. And for me it's I don't know if it's just because I've worked with this for a lot of years or have another awareness, I don't know. But I think for me, it's so natural which side of me that I'm tapping into. When I teach as a yoga therapist, I'm often very feminine because people are coming to me and what I consider feminine
Mm,
with different kinds of vulnerabilities, and they need for me the more nurturing side, the part of me that are bringing life, being a creator. And when I teach the Wim Hof method, I can also be very feminine, but that's a workout of the breathing muscles. So often people like to have a more masculine approach. It's also about science. What again, you said you don't agree, but what society have in some way considered masculine, being reasonable, being scientific instead of emotional. Um, and when I'm teaching yoga, again, like I'm having the soft voice and I'm like, allow yourself to feel. And when I'm doing the Wim Hof method, I'm like, breathe. And it's more into the masculine, right? So for me, it's just, why would I only use one when I
mm,
can not have 1 plus 1, but I'm having 1 plus 1 giving 5, because I
mm,
can vary this and find my own balance. And I think having that empathy or allowing all the other things that clouds this beautiful ocean of potential, that having, I think, a more balanced relationship with your own polarity or whatever you identify as male, female, is a resource.
mm.
And I
With
think
that,
it's
I was confronted to that question when running conflict workshops. So often people associate conflicts with, at first, men.
mm-hmm.
But then very quickly you unpack the conflicts, and there's a lot of also hysteria, masculine hysteria, feminine hysteria, which do look different. Um, and the what I do when I host a workshop that is about conflicts, or particularly when I'm hosting a conflict mediation, is that I'm often having to address this idea that the masculine hasn't got that kind protective, what we often call feminine characteristic, empathic kind. And so what I do is I demonstrate to them in the workshop that you can place a very, very firm boundary that is highly respectful while still in that sort of slightly what we label as feminine energy. But it's associated with the masculine, putting a boundary. Historically, it's the men who cut, who even in the runic systems, there was this idea that some of the runes denote that the man is the one who's transitioning between the one phase of life and then the other through their like cha, that energy is often been historically associated with the man. But I think also midwifery. So sometimes I play with this and I say, I'm like your midwife. You have a tension, you have unfulfilled needs, you don't know what they are, and you're trying to collectively find them out so that you can collectively find a solution that fits everybody's needs. I'm like a midwife of that. And they look at me and they go like, you what? And so like I definitely align with you on the idea that it's about finding your own internal masculine and feminine and tapping into them and just being able, perhaps with a certain amount of fluidity, to use them in behavior. Then but it still doesn't change the fact that it's almost like nobody really wants to have those labels. But this opens up a paradox. Like one of my adoptive daughters says, like, I just want everybody to be happy. We're talking a lot about trance. I totally understand why we're talking about it. I agree with a lot of the points, but I think there's too much conversation about it, and we should just be able to just get on with enjoying our own, a bit like what we just said now, being happy who we are with whatever we have inside and just get on with it. My other adoptive daughter, who's talked about um, gender post-genderism, was talking about, well, basically what would happen if you just remove the whole gender thing and go into more like a differentiating on the basis of having the choice. She used the metaphor of having a door in a room. Why don't we just have all the doors equal and we can just choose any door we want and go and curiously explore them and not have hidden doors or locked doors?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this is actually really aligned with what the two males that I interviewed said about what they wanted to change, because my dad, at first, I totally didn't get it, but he started like, my dad, I always thought like he would be the best ambassador. He worked with like computer security, so it's not even close, but he's always like on one side and the other one, and being like very um analytic, and like from one side and the other side. And but what he said here, when I asked like what's not good about the male dominant world we're living in, is he started to talk about dictators. And I totally did not see like where he was headed. But what I kind of like got out of the conversation, trying to ask more questions, what was, and the other male kind of said the same thing, that if we're just over in one polarity, then it gets unhealthy. And I really don't feel comfortable calling it toxic masculinity, because I think like that's such a bad label. But what they said was that if it's just male dominated, then it's missing something, and that can evolve into being one-sided, like a dictatorship, or just like loneliness, or like using like, I don't know if that's an international expression, but in Denmark we have like, you have sharp elbows, like you're pushing your way up where you want to go. And they, as male, both said that that was the negativity about being in a male dominated world. And for me, also resonating with what you just said, is like, for me, it doesn't matter. I think if you're too much in the female, too much in the masculine, we talked about being on two different sides of the road last time as well. It's totally the same principle. And it actually is with everything in life. It's again like the Buddhists say, like the golden middle path, that we need to find balance, because masculine and feminine isn't something you can label as good or bad or better. It's the balance, it's the integration. And that's actually what I got from what they said.
And what you just said reminded me of this picture that I drew like about 8 years ago. I'm just going to zoom out a second so we can see this.
Yeah.
This was like an attempt at removing the topic of gender and replacing it with the Asian concept of polarity of yin yang, with how they would do it with animal personification. So in other words, it's an attempt to step away from the ego of I am a man, I am a woman, and go one step towards what you just said, which is that we have both inside us. And how do we identify and use those two different aspects? Now, came another problem with this, is that if we think the masculine is the dog, canine, so the yin is the follow, the yang is the lead, which often is associated with masculine lead, feminine follow, like in couple dancing. But if you remove gender from that and you say actually any man or woman can lead and follow, but there is a character that you can say, well, Margaret Thatcher is a masculine. So if there is that kind of attribute that we still identify, that is not only about leading and following, because you can have follower dogs, you can have leader wolves, you can have follower cats and leader tigers. What that created is a completely new level of self-awareness of, first of all, where is my ego? Where am I identifying who do I think I am? Like, and that I think is the beginning of where the problems start, is when somebody talks in the first person of I am a man, or I identify and present as a male, and that all the characteristics that come from society are attached to it, they are trapped. Whereas if they can separate from their ego and go like, oh, it's a vehicle that looks like a dog, and it has its pros and cons. It's off-road pretty okay, but it can go really fast on the motorway. Right, okay, same thing. My body vehicle is what it is, but I can step away from it and look at it critically. That, I think, has been the biggest learning from this, is that it doesn't matter how we label gender. Are we talking about polarity? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking even about personality traits? As long as we can like step back and go, actually, can I have a giggle at myself? Can I honestly laugh at myself and detach from that ego? And or am I stuck in it to the point that somebody talks about it, I immediately defend my position because I am the vehicle? And that has been like so tricky, because by adding labels, we don't address the problem. By changing the label, we don't address the problem. The fundamental thing underneath, I've found, has been always like, are we able to step away from our identities in general, whether they're gendered or other forms of identities?
I'm just going to bring this conversation to a completely different level right now, because like sometimes I love to be like really playful. And when I
Mm,
saw that sketch and you started to explain,
mm,
I got like this inner picture of me being like oh, what's that called? That show with Pikachu.
mm.
And I would be like, I would have like 4 balls, and I'll be like, I'm calling on the wolf, and I'm calling on the canine. That's
But that,
how I
yeah,
would live
yeah,
my life. Like I have all 4 of them
yeah,
inside of me, and I
yeah,
am calling them out depending on the situation.
yeah.
And yeah, I shared that last time, had a lot of people called me like, you have such a masculine energy. And I think I look pretty female, and I'm okay with being both. And you can do whatever, because I feel comfortable in my body knowing that this is just a physical expression of me. I have the 4 balls inside, and I can call them out as I please, because
Mm,
like I'm seeing them, accepting them, and sometimes also like one of them comes out in the wrong situation.
mm.
And that's also just like for me about accept and to get to know these 4 sides of us.
It's like, it's almost like those superpowers. Like you could say, I have the superpowers. They're just there. I can tap into them, and like it's almost like, how do we? Because now we've debriefed, I think, what we've heard from the different people. I think there's been maybe a
I
few other
had
things
one
that
that I
you
didn't
mentioned. Go
share.
on, go on.
Yeah, yeah. My mom, when I asked her like, what would you like to change? And this is kind of funny, but also really sad. She said like, I would love for men to not see females as mates. I was like, wow.
What does that mean to her?
It means to her that she feels that she has to do everything domestic, and it's just something that's expected. And I think that's also what she recognized with some of her friends at that age group, that the
Mm,
males are, it's like the classical thing where the males are helping at home. And if they cook every Saturday, they want to be praised. Like, I'm cooking every Saturday. I'm
mm,
really
mm,
helping her, instead of this being something that's joined and like, you're not helping, like you're part of it. Come on. And I think that's an attitude or like a way of seeing the world that's perhaps more general in that generation above us than we have, and even more in the next generation. So I
mm.
just thought it's interesting that this is also part of the whole gender and like what's going on. That sometimes I think we really want to think we are further than that, but that's also the reality for
It,
some.
it open it does open up, like that triggered me, by the way. I just mentioned that on passing, just out of intellectual honesty, because I often cook a lot, and I've
Yeah.
often deliberately made house chores as equal as possible. And constantly when I hear this, I go like, oh, like, does it mean that I have to cook for 10 lifetimes so that this changes? How, can I ever be acknowledged in sometimes also wanting to be cooked for, without being accused of being an entitled man? Like, that's why it triggered me, is because sometimes I also like to be cooked for,
Yeah.
in that nurturing sense. But that's past. That's the trigger that's going to disappear soon, because I'm changing the balance of that. But the paradox that came to me when I was talking to, particularly to my non-binary daughter, is that she's a creative, and she basically said to me, there needs to be more freedom of choice, more freedom of being. Great, okay, but we also know that in creativity, the creative potential is directly proportional to the limits that you put on the creative sandbox. Like, if you give a white canvas to somebody, it's harder than if you give them a white canvas with a set of oil paints, with a nature theme, and an idea of painting in 1 hour.
Yeah.
And if you open the canvas even more and say, like, it's not a canvas, it's anything you want, anything is art, it creates usually what artists call is creative block. And I've worked with creativity for 25 years, and I've seen that in practice, that people don't like boundaries because they see it as a lack of freedom. They don't want the boundaries because they're like, I'm an artist, I'm free. But
Yeah.
actually, it's those very boundaries that create the yummy creative outputs. And the paradox I noticed is that, well, let's apply that thinking to gender. If we remove all labeling, and if let's imagine that we can redraw a society where gender doesn't matter, it's just like personality. You go to a place, you measure your personality, you measure your gender, you might have some equity based advantages, women, men, introverts, extroverts, they're all on the same level of awareness. But then is the creative potential that being thrown out the window? Because with creativity, the restrictions is what creates creativity. So are we in danger is the question on my mind. It's maybe a yes no question. Is maybe I'll open it as an open question, not a closed question. As a creative question, how might we keep the creative yumminess or the creative playground which gender opens up when we drop gendering and we start going into gender fluidity, non-binary thinking? How do we still keep that creative freedom is kind of the
Yeah.
paradox that I got stuck on.
No, I really love that because I am, for me, that's a whole life philosophy that I actually first started practicing when I became a mom 25 years ago. That I wanted my daughter to have like really firm boundaries, but very wide boundaries. So there was so much freedom within the boundaries, but they were still there to create the space of being held.
Mm,
And I also feel I'm the same way as a friend, as a lover, as a whatever. But I haven't actually thought about it in the regards that you say. And I think it's really interesting because, yeah, I so agree with the whole creative process that you're mentioning. So, what I'm thinking is like, what would be the framework you could give within polarity? Would it be like, I don't know, like this is not realistic, but just as an example, would it be like a part of the elementary school like this? If we're going with your drawing, this is the four like archetypes of polarity, or not sexuality, but of like male female, and that would be the frame. And then people could be like, hey, today I'm identifying as a
mm,
dog, or like, could that be a frame that would work? And the thing is with the thing is with these things
mm,
is like people will always argue and people will always want things to be in a certain way. So it's, I don't think it's possible to create like a setting, even though the paradox is that we are already living in them,
mm,
just
mm.
different settings. So I think, how would we get new framing in around how we see ourselves in polarity, sexuality, or masculine, feminine? And I think if we had the answer, then we would get some pretty interesting calls after this ended.
Since the topic that, like, I think they're intertwined, gender and sexuality. If
Yeah.
we just untangle them a second and go, okay, let's take sexuality and remove gender from that and go, actually, it doesn't matter what gender, and let's talk about the polarity of sexuality. In other words, the lead follow the attraction, that when there is a lot of attraction, when there is little attraction. What I've noticed is that when you remove polarity, and usually when you remove gender and you remove polarity of any form of lead follow dynamics, it creates a lack of passion, and then the sexual drive disappears or goes down. Now, vice versa, if I were to just play the devil's advocate for gender, I would say what the current situation of gender is that gender allows, in some cases, sexual polarity to be cultivated, even within same gender relations. Um, so if we were to remove the gender construct from it and keep only the polarity in the sexual play, then perhaps one way of answering that question would be that if we remove gender, we need to start bringing a higher awareness of what is lead follow polarity that creates that yummy sexual tension between people, which is, well, some could argue it's not necessary because we're overpopulated and we only should have sex to have babies, and therefore we shouldn't cultivate polarity. It's only procreation. But I'm more of the opinion that sexuality is a spiritual life force that is more than just creative, and therefore
Yeah.
for learning about oneself and the other person. You were going to say?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I feel like once again, we're moving into a field that's perhaps I'm seeing the time not to like restrict ourselves. We're almost about an hour. And for me,
Yeah.
this is like a topic that could be several hours as well. And
Mm,
I'm just saying that I totally agree with you, but also I feel this is because both of us have a knowledge. We have both studied this topic, have literally educations in it, and
mm,
have awareness and also experience with it. But I think
mm,
for most people, this is something that is completely new, that there are different polarities within sexualities that's not related to your physical body.
mm,
And
mm,
also, I think like a lot of people's sexuality is on autopilot. Like somewhere around like 16 it stopped, and they're just like repeat, repeat. It's literally like press play. They don't
mm,
question it. It's still, it feels good. Like, why not? Instead of like really exploring it. But I remember also when I first started to get involved or like curious about like the physical part of Tantra, I had experiences where I was like, you can't really explain this to people. Like, it's like you drank milk your whole life, and all of a sudden, someone is serving you a coffee or a cacao. And like, wow, I only thought they were milk. You cannot
mm.
like, how would you even imagine that there's coffee or cacao if you only had milk? So it's
Yeah.
such complicated, and it's yeah, it's I wouldn't say yeah complicated, but also totally not complicated topic.
Mm,
But
mm,
it's like
mm.
for sure a different level and a whole other for me topic to fold out.
Yeah, what I've got so far, beyond the negatives of okay, gender is a problem, is that everybody wants to be seen.
Yeah,
Everybody wants to be accepted and loved in their own completely unique version of gender and sexuality, and that there is no good reason for that to not happen other than lack of education and awareness to do so. So if we take that and what we've just talked about, and the conversation is going more then towards sexuality, which for me is fine because it
yeah,
segues into tantra and everything, and it might be a more interesting topic if we just decide, okay, we're going to drop gender from this. How do we create gender harmony? Okay, well, let's just drop gender altogether. But um, you know, to challenge ourselves between now and the next session, which is next Monday. Did I see right in social that you're hosting a group of people on the weekend doing some Wim Hof stuff?
yeah,
You are okay. I'm hosting Sunday night a group of men. Whoever turns up, some of you might be even watching this. But if we do that, our challenge, maybe we could use the fact that we're hosting a group and use that as a laboratory for our homework in between the sessions, if you like. I don't know. That just came to me when I saw your post about this weekend's event. It might not be appropriate, but maybe we could build ourselves a challenge based on those two collective horizontal, because the first one was about vertical. It was about, parent children.
yeah.
Horizontal is more peers. Could be tantra. We could also just, use that as a playground. But it might be that our peers in those sessions could be a worthwhile. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think I would like to have something more concrete. Like, I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Like, what would be a question, or what would be a narrative, or like what are we actually exploring in this setting, horizontal?
Mm. It's this whole thing of an ego, because I don't think asking about the difficult questions is always necessarily the best approach. Like there's a process in company management, change management is called appreciative inquiry. You might have heard of it, which basically says that the best way to change a systemic problem in an organization is not to go and inquire about the problem. It's inquiring about what other people have found as working solutions to that very problem. So focusing those interviews with people on what has worked, right? Rather than go like, what's the problem? Dissect it, break it apart in a Cartesian analytical way. We would go like, okay, in the topic of gender harmony, what has worked? So maybe what we could take as an angle is that if you're working with breath and you're tapping into that, maybe that masculine side of you working with the like breath on the scientific level, I'm working with a bunch of guys. I'm taking the more, in a way, feminine role, the more sort of midwife role, where I'm saying, oh, giving birth to their like expression of pain and going beyond that. So I'm kind of taking my feminine role as a host. You're going into your wolf / dog role in there. I don't know that or maybe it's just the polarity game. But maybe the question for you and I could be twofold. There's an internal question that we can debrief, just you and I, which is about if we consciously enter that hosting, and because we can shape shift, we can tap into that inner masculine and that inner feminine, and we can label it any other way. We can talk about yin and yang, but let's just say we tap into those different sides of ourselves. But if we consciously then go into that event doing the same as we usually do, but consciously choose to embody, in my case, the feminine, in your case, the masculine, and ask them around what has worked in their lives for gender harmony. And it might be too difficult for them to answer. Is we just sit back, own reaction to the events unfolding, or maybe you have a better question.
Now, I think what would be also more relevant for my workshop, it's a Wim Hof Method Fundamentals, and it has like 3 different sessions. It's like a science session or like a talkative session. Then we have the breath work, that's pretty intense, and then actually I'm bringing 20 people into an ice bath.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires, as I said, for me actually all 4 roles, because it also depends if I think the ice bath is a really good example. Going into an ice bath is potentially deadly, and most people have pretty intense reactions to that. And I actually I can't say like just like this. Perhaps if I give it a thought, like, is there a different approach how men get in or how females get in? But also, am I actually guiding male or females differently? So for me, that could be an interesting like topic to see both how are they acting, and also I was thinking like it could be an interesting thing to actually also address it with them, like is there like a good advice from the female side of the audience or like participants to the male and the other way around, or is male having a different just experience with this, and also how is it to be pressed or pushed by a female?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that could be really juicy as a sort of debrief when you've gone through the whole process with them. They survived. Yeah, yeah.
Hopefully.
Oh, that's part of the game. Cool. So that could be the investigation. That could be the practical side of it, because as you're hosting, of course, you have to be present to the group. That's the
Yeah.
primary focus. And I'll take the same as what you just said. I actually tap into all the different sides of me as well. Hosting.
Yeah.
There's the chewing side. There's the very like challenging side. Right, come on, guys, we're gonna do this. It's a bunch of dudes who are like sometimes need to be shaken up and challenged. So, yeah, I think I will ask them, how would it be different if I was now hosting, and I would be hosting you as a group of women, or how would you feel if I was a woman in hosting that exact same thing? I think those 2 angles are very interesting, and we can debrief that on Monday in our next conversation and see where that goes. By the way, that next conversation is about talking about the horizontal, so we can then follow that up with creative questions that we might end up dropping the whole gender construct altogether and making something else take the stage. Let's see. As a checkout, Gitte, for today, since this is part 2 of 5, did we get enough conflicts for your liking today? As a checkout question.
Yeah, and I love that you asked that. And I think like conflicts have lots of different phases. So did we have like a heated debate? No. Did we trigger each other a lot? I actually don't think so. But I think that the conversation we had today had more edge than we did last time, in my opinion. So for me, that's also a level of conflict, because I hope that this will like have small loving daggers sent out to people that would like, keep working. Like that hit something inside of me that I'll keep processing or changing. So in that way, yes, absolutely.
And as you said that, there was a comment on LinkedIn, an anonymous comment that says, like, just jumped into this conversation and heard that many people's sexuality is on autopilot. Wow. Like a little nugget from what we were talking about earlier. So yeah, thank you. For me, it was there was definitely enough of my head. Perhaps this is the reflection of me being in that gender of being uncomfortable about talking, but
Mm,
it's super challenging, but it's really interesting. And I'm my takeaway from today is really that it doesn't matter the level of conflict or challenge, is that I feel grateful to be able to have that quality of connection with you. We've not even met face to face,
no, yet.
and we're having this like level of conversation which is more deep and meaningful than I can have sometimes with family, friends, lovers, because it's so raw and authentic that I feel privileged and grateful about that. And so that's my takeaway from today. So thank you, Gitte.
Oh, thank you. That's really beautiful. And likewise, I'm so enjoying this, and I feel so inspired by our talk and about also like your point of view and like how you're presenting things and your presence. So thank you so much for that as well.
See you next Monday. I will send you the links and add on social all the content. See you all next Monday, 11 o'clock. Ciao.
Bye.